Hey everybody, so welcome. This is our second night of our poultry judging science um, series. Super excited about last week. I hope everybody that couldn't join us was able to watch it. I did get some feedback and it seems like people really enjoyed it. So super happy to have Amy back today to talk a little bit more about poultry judging. And with that, I will let Amy just do a quick overview. So Amy, in the chat, we're hearing loss of pigmentation when laying. I learned how to tell if a chicken has laid a lot of eggs. Older chickens lose color as they get older, and then they and their names. So very good.
So one of the other things I wanted to jump in and just double check and clarify was a question that was asked at the beginning of last class, which was, what's the biology behind the pigment loss of chickens? So I looked it up to double check. And so what it is as a hen lays eggs, she's not actually pulling pigment out of her current skin. What's happening is that the skin layer that you see on top is old skin, right? So we produce skin from inside our body outward. So do chickens. And so as that skin wears and sloughs off, the new layers of skin are underneath. Because the chicken is putting all of those colorants, those carotenoids from her feed, basically from the corn she's consuming, maybe she's consuming some marigold petals or maybe paprika to fortify the color of the yolk. She's going to push all of that into her eggs, and she's not going to put that into her skin and her fat. So as her yellow color sloughs off, it's replaced with skin that is lighter in color. So that's how we get the bleach.
Change your name.
Okay. So I see a lot of great things in the chat. Thank you so much. I think one of the biggest takeaways from last week was pigment loss. And you'll see today that we're going to focus a lot on pigment loss when we go to the judging classes. That's a really big part of this. One of the things that I want to make sure that we get off the table before we begin is, are there any questions that are trickling around, bouncing around in your brain from last week? You can either raise your hand and we'll unmute you, or you can just put them in the chat, and it can be anything related to what we learned last week. So I'll give a solid 15 seconds for you to do that. And if we don't have anybody at the end of 15 seconds, I'll move on.
I am not seeing any hand raising or questions coming in the chat at this point, Amy.
That's absolutely fine. Great. So we're going to learn how to handle chickens today. Many of you are probably very familiar with handling your birds. For show birds, it's going to be a little different. The birds that you're using in a show setting have probably never been handled before, not extensively. Maybe they were moved from the pullet house into the laying house, and maybe they were pulled out to get vaccinated, but that's it. There's not a lot of hands-on interaction that these chickens have with their human caretakers. So typically they're going to be from a cage setting. In those cage settings, each chicken has a rather small space to operate in, but the size of the cage is large. So the cage would be like this size, like the one behind me, but it would be filled with many chickens. And so the chickens all get turns rotating out, going to the feeder and that sort of thing. So they're very comfortable with cages. What they're not comfortable with is us handling them. So we need to be very gentle when we handle them, and we need to be very slow and quiet and confident when we handle them. Chickens that have been in a laying scenario, especially if they're towards the end of their life, they're going to have weaker bones. And so it's going to be very careful for us to be very gentle with them when we pick them up. These girls behind me are some of my white rocks from our laying flock, our flock free ranges. So these girls you can see them pacing back and forth in the cage. That's because they don't like me handling them, and they don't like being in a cage. So there's a little added challenge today, but I think we'll get the point across in terms of how to handle these girls. I picked white rocks because they're very similar in color to what you'll see in contest, as Jen shared last week. The birds that you're going to be judging in contest are mostly going to be white, and the birds that we have in our practice contests online that we'll introduce you to today are also white. We're not going to see brown birds. So you have the information about brown birds should you maybe find them in your contest, but it's very likely they're going to be white. Okay. So I guess what we'll start with is chicken behavior in a cage. So chickens, like people, are either right-handed or left-handed. I know that sounds super weird, but a chicken will choose a foot to be dominant with and step with forward first. So when we scare them by reaching into a cage, when we disrupt their norm, they're going to step in a direction, and that's either going to be typically left or right. So as I reach into the cage, you'll notice the hens will spin a certain way. This cage is probably about 3 times larger than what you'll see at contest. You won't see 2 birds in a cage, there'll only be 1 bird, but the 4 cages, 1 for each bird, will be lined up next to each other. Like that, okay? And so you're only working with 1 bird in a cage, which is good. Typically, the birds that you're going to handle aren't going to be like flying up at the top of the cage. They're going to be very used to the cage, very comfortable with the cage, and they're going to try to run from you if anything else. Very rarely are the hens going to go and peck you if they're in the cage, just because they have no reason to. But if they do know that if you've ever been picked by a chicken, it's not too bad. It doesn't, cause bleeding or anything like that. So that's good. So what I'm going to do is demonstrate to you how these birds move when I reach into the cage. See, there we go. We'll move that a little closer. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reach in and we'll see. Actually, I'm going to pull one of these birds out so that we can focus on one at a time. I know. I have a cage down here I'm popping her into. All right. So what you'll notice when I reach into the cage is the bird's going to choose a direction. So she chose to go right. I'm going to reach in again. She chose to go left. I'm going to reach in again. She chooses to go left. So she's probably a left-handed bird. So when I go to catch her, I'm going to try to catch her as she runs towards my hand. So I know she tries to circle left. So I'm going to go in with my right hand to move her left and then catch her with my left hand. And of course, the cage isn't going to be this deep when you're judging. So I have to reach in the cage. I know. Okay, so I caught her. So generally it's pretty easy to do. And if you want practice, you can set up a cage at home and put some birds in there, 1 bird at a time, and just practice getting them out. When you handle these birds, like I said, their bones are not super duper strong because they've been in a cage setting and have laid a lot of eggs. So the way that you're going to handle them is generally from the body, and you don't want to grab a leg. Never grab a leg. That's a really bad thing for a laying hen. So you'll want to grab them like a football. So see how I'm kind of holding her around the belly. And if you tug her up close to you, she's going to calm down. I know, except for this one who is not very calm today. I know, it's fine. All right, so I'm going to put her back in the cage and we'll go through and catch her again, just to show you that again. That was fine, right? All right. So I'm kind of using my hand to guide her breast towards my other hand so I can kind of clasp onto her. All right. So again, she moved in a way that I expected her to. She moved to her left. Okay, I know. All right, so another way that you can catch them if you can't get your hand on the body is to grab both legs at the same time. I don't recommend this, but if you need to, you can. And so what I do is I will go in there, grab both hocks, so both knee joints together, and then I will very gently bring her to the ground, pull the legs out from under her, and support her breastbone on my hand. If we pull her down and she slaps onto her breast really hard, it might hurt her breastbone, and that's not good. We don't want to do that. So as you'll see, I'm going to reach in, grab her legs, and then support her breastbone as I pull her out of the cage. I know, I'm sorry. Thank you. So she did not want to cooperate, but that's typically how you do it. I'll do it one more time. Let's see if she'll cooperate. Okay. Reach in. I know, we want to get out. Grab both legs, supporting her breastbone, and then taking her out. Now see how I'm holding her legs? So this is where her drumstick, oh, I know. This is where her drumstick meets her leg. And I'm holding both of those in my hand. That's going to be the sturdiest spot to hold a bird. That's where her bones are thickest. And by holding 2 feet together, that's going to help balance her. All right, so now we've taken the bird out of the cage. And at this point, we can go through our evaluation. So the first thing that we want to do is, let's get my screen back up here, look at pigment loss. So pigment loss is going to be our #1 determinant of how we place our hen classes. And we need to express to the judges that, yes, we've looked at all of the things on this list in order, and we've determined that over looking through these things, the hen has bleached through her vent, eye ring, earlobe, beak, bottom of foot, hock, and then the top of the foot. So we'll start with the vent. And so what I like to do is I've got this bird supported so that my pointer finger is between her legs. And then my middle finger and my thumb are squeezing her legs together. This stabilizes her. And by holding her body close to mine, it prevents her from flapping. I can trade hands by just sliding my other pointer finger on, flipping her so that her breastbone's resting on my arm. And there I've got her held in another secure posture. And you can just flip hands like that. Sometimes you might be judging with other folks in the room at the same time, just so that the classes go a little faster. If that's the case, you may be handing a bird off to somebody. You're not supposed to talk to them during that time, but you may be handing a bird off to somebody, in which case you do it in a manner where you keep the bird calm, make sure that they have their hand ready, and then transfer that bird. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the vent. So the vent of the bird it's easy to find on past production hens. My girls have molted, so they have a lot of feathers back there. But in a past production hen, she's going to usually have no feathers right here, and it's going to be kind of rotund and sticking out a little bit. This girl obviously is fully feathered. So I'm going to have to look really hard for the vent. And so what I'll do is I'll pull the tail feathers up, because you see where the tail feathers go upward and then they go outward. So where that differentiation is, that's where you're going to find the vent. So you're going to go ahead, spread the feathers gently. And there's her little vent right there. And it winks at you. That's just the natural response to you showing her vent to the air. And so I'm looking at the vent of this bird and it's totally bleached. There's no pigment, no yellow pigment there. Okay, so I say, okay, her vent is bleached. So now I'm going to go look at the next part, which is the eye ring. So I hold her up.
Me.
And so I'm looking at one side, and then I look at the other side using the same light. And I can tell this bird has a bleached eye ring. And it might be hard to see here, but we'll see this in the judging contests. But there's no yellow pigment in her face. Next is the earlobe. And I'm just going to check right behind the earlobe. Look for any pigment. I know. No, nothing there. Check the other one just in case. Sometimes they lose pigment on one side and not the other. Very rarely, but it can happen. And it's all bleached out back there. So I say, well, the vent's bleached, the eye ring is bleached, the earlobe is bleached. So what's next? And what's next is the beak from the back of the face to the tip. So looking at this bird, oh, I know. I will look at her. This is the way that I look at her. So I will hold up her head, look at her beak on one side, look at her beak on the other side. She's got mostly bleached out. I know it's hard to tell on this video, but she is mostly bleached out. I don't see any yellow on the tip of her beak. So that indicates to me that she is bleached out for what she is, her breed. Next, I say, okay, let's look at the bottom of the feet. Her toesies are dirty because she's a free range bird. So there's a couple different ways that you can hold them when you're looking at their feet. So up to this point, we've held the bird this way, right? So we can look at her face, look at her vent, but now it's going to be hard to look at their feet, especially if you've got small hands. So what we do, I'm gonna back up just a little tiny touch so you can see this technique. We are going to flip the bird. And so we will grasp her right behind her knees. Oh. I like to do it from the front. And then you're gonna hang her upside down like this. Okay. Don't have her upside down for too long if you do that, because it's hard on their respiratory system. Chickens don't have a diaphragm like we do. Like right here, we have a diaphragm that separates our lungs from the rest of our guts, right? And chickens don't have that. So when we flip them upside down, everything kind of pushes on their air sacs and it's stressful. So we want to have them upside down for as little time as possible. So we can either hold them like this and look at their feet this way, or have them entirely upside down, whichever is most comfortable for you and whichever is most comfortable for the bird. I'm gonna set her down for a sec because she's getting antsy. Yeah. And you might have to do that. So if you find that your bird is really just stressing out and kicking around, maybe you've got a hand on a feather and it's pulling weird, or maybe you've got a flap of skin that's pulled weird and she's just not comfortable, you can stick her back in the cage and then pull her back out. That's absolutely fine. So I picked her up again, and I'm gonna look at the bottoms of her feet, and I don't see any yellow pigment there. I see a little bit of yellow pigment there. It's very dirty, but you're looking at this part of the foot. A little bit up into the toes, but mostly that main pad of her foot. She's going to lose her skin the last in between her toes because that's getting the least wear. So she's pushing her foot into the ground for the most part. Between her toes is probably where you're going to see pigment, if you're going to see any. Okay. So I say, well, she's got a little bit of pigment between her toes on the bottoms of her pads. So let's look at her hock. So the way that I like to hold them for this is move them so that they're laying on their side. Okay, laying on their side. But I'm still got that grip with my finger between their legs and my other fingers holding her drumsticks together for stability. So I have her on my side, she's tucked up against my chest, and I can now look at her shanks, which are right here, in the light. So I'm going to use the light that I'm most comfortable with. Take a look at them on that side. You can flip her, look at them on the other side. Okay, and then make your decision there. So that's how you do the shanks. The other way that folks do this, and I'm not comfortable holding a bird this way, but you can just hold her like a kid, like a child, up against your chest, like this. Get that wingy in there, thank you. And then you can pull her legs forward to look at the tops of her legs and the tops of her toes in the front of her shank. Or you can keep them held like a football on their side and just kind of gently rotate their feet, rotate your hand so that you've kind of got her flipped on her back a little bit, and look at the tops of the toes. Okay. So this bird, I see there's a lot of yellow on the tops of her toes. So if there was another layer in the group who had less pigment, that layer would be placed over this bird. This bird hasn't lost as much pigment as the other one. Okay, I'm going to give her a break and I'm going to pull out her friend. And we're going to look at the other characteristics and how to handle birds for those characteristics. So when we're judging, 95% of what we're judging is based on that pigment loss order. And when you're talking to a judge, you will say, this bird placed above this bird because birds A, B, and C, so the two birds lost pigment in their eye ring, their vent, their earlobe, and their beak, but bird A had more pigment on the tops of her toes and up her shank than bird B. For that reason, I placed bird B above bird A. That's an example of how we'd say that. So if we have to look at a bird in for the other capacity questions, so the current lay questions, the abdominal capacity, fat, and molt, we need to hold them slightly different. So let me grab a second bird and we'll go do that. while I'm grabbing her, if you would please, if you have any questions, raise your hand or pop a question into the chat.
For the shelter club, every year they. Oh, I know.
Are there any questions out there? Anybody have any questions? Raise your hand. Or put it in the mute and we will try to get it answered.
Oh, I know. This is a grumpy one. So this is going to show you how to handle a grumpy bird. But we'll wait another couple of seconds here, see if anybody has questions.
This is a random question. Do any of your birds have names?
Not related to the topic, but yes, about 50 of our birds have names.
Okay, because
Yeah.
all of my birds have names. So
Yeah.
I'm just
Yep. In most small flocks, a lot of folks name their birds. That's definitely typical.
I have a question.
Yeah,
So can you see my screen?
I can, yes.
Okay, let me introduce myself real quick. I'm doing the Poultry Club for Putnam County.
Okay.
And I'm the lead founder and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So here's one of my chicks. I think she's just like 8 weeks old, but she's a lot different than what you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And if she were to be, judged and everything, how would her hold on, let me get her to stop moving so you can see her neck. Hold on. So she doesn't have feathers on her neck.
Yes.
Because that's her breed.
Yeah, she's a showgirl.
Yeah. A lot of different breeds. They're super different than normal chickens. Like I have a bunch of frizzles and everything.
Yeah.
Would that be like category wise and everything, or would it just general? I don't know how to say it, like general,
Yeah. So would that come into effect when we're judging past production hens? Is kind of what your question is.
Yeah.
She's super cute.
Yeah.
But we'll actually never see her breed or any frizzles or any bantams or any blackbirds or black, melanistic birds like a Australorps can sometimes have some melanin, silkies have melanin, and then the other one is I am Shamani. All we're gonna see is white leghorns in the cages. So sometimes you'll see the production reds. So it's either white leghorns or production reds. So we don't have to worry about judging the pigment on any of these other breeds.
Okay.
Yep, that's a good question. It makes this really easy.
Yeah.
Yep. Awesome.
Well, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Anything coming to the chat, Jen or Brian?
I think Jen's kind of answered it. I think we're pretty well. They're just talking about that chicken.
Showgirls are fun. Genetically, they're really weird. All right. So back to our production hens, we're going to look at abdominal capacity first. So this is the hen's body larger than another hen? When we do this is when we have two birds that are really close together in terms of how they look bleaching wise, so close that we can't tell them apart. And so what we'll do then is put two birds side by side and say, okay, which has the bigger abdominal capacity? That's our first thing that we do. So when we're looking at abdominal capacity, we're going to check from top to bottom and then just her general overall capacity. So we're going to do the pelvic spread. Actually, this girl's coming out of molt, so she's not super wide pelvic spread. But if you look at the area where the feathers on the tail go up, vent feathers go out, you're going to feel right there, and there's going to be two bones that stick out like little pointers, and you'll feel them. In a chick, they'll be really close together, or in a pullet. In a laying bird, they're going to be further apart because she's in lay and she's pushed an egg through that gap, and she's spread those bones apart. The farther apart that they're spread, the more of an abdominal capacity she has, if she's the same age as the other bird that you're judging, which she should be. So what we'll do is we'll take our fingers. I know she's a 2-finger width because I did this. And I know, sweetheart. And put your fingers in between those pelvic bones and take a measure. She's 2 fingers wide back there. If the other bird that you're judging is 3, that's really easy to say, okay, the abdominal capacity of this bird's probably better. The second thing that we do is we know where those pelvic bones are. So where the feathers go up and the feathers go out, that's where the pelvic bones are. And then at the bottom of her body, you'll feel the keel bone. So it's going to be inwards a little bit on her belly, but you'll feel the bottom of the keel bone. And then you'll measure from the pelvic bones where they stick out down to that keel bone. So this bird's about 3 fingers wide. Some birds can be 4 fingers, some birds can be larger. I'm also an adult, so my hands are a little bit bigger. I joke that I have man hands. So you might need to do 2 measurements, or you might need to put your hand on and slide it down and just estimate how big that pelvic capacity is. So again, so we measure width, depth, and then generally how they stand. So I showed you the method where you pick up a bird and you're gonna measure the capacity this way. And you can do that for these girls. The way that I have also been shown how to do it is by placing them in a cage together and just looking at their bodies. Okay. So I'm looking at these 2 birds together. All right. And if they will, could you walk around, please? I need you to show off, please. Thank you. Perfect. So you can see that the whiter color bird has a deeper body than the darker color bird. And so just from that, I can say, well, the white bird has a larger abdominal capacity than the browner colored bird. If your birds are going to be in a cage with a number, so it'll be like number 1 has more abdominal capacity than number 3, or number 4 has more than number 2, like that. Okie doke. So the next part of this is looking at abdominal fat. I'm going to get my friendly one out. The other one was she was panicking a little bit, so we're not going to go there again. Oh my goodness. Oh, I know. Okay. So the next part is abdominal fat. So hens accumulate fat in this area. So right below where their tail feathers go up and out, this whole area down here accumulates fat. And a fatter hen is a hen who is not laying as many eggs because she's not putting that fat into the egg yolk, and instead she's accumulating it and getting chunky. So fatter birds are going to place lower than thinner birds. And this again is if your pigment is all the same, your abdominal capacity is all the same. In the case of these 2 birds, if they were the same pigment loss wise, I'd look at the white bird and say the white bird has bigger abdominal capacity, so she places above this bird. And that would be the end of that. I wouldn't go this far. But if you're looking to assess fat, what you'll do is you'll take your fingers and pinch them and kind of feel how chubby she is back there. Be gentle because her intestines are back there, right? There's a fat pad and intestine. So be very, very gentle. Just feel the general amount of fat. And then you can compare that to your next bird. For molt, again, you probably will never do molt, but if you do, I know. I'm gonna angle this down a little bit, so maybe this is easier to see. So you're gonna spread her wing, and you're gonna identify where the primary feathers are and where the secondary feathers are. Primary feathers and secondary feathers are separated by an axial feather. The axial feather is this little dinky feather. Oops, right here. Right? So it's where that wing tip moves independently. The wing tip is all your primaries, and there's 10 of them. So you look at the primaries, if they're all approximately the same length, they all look about the same coloring, you can be fairly confident that she's not in molt. If she's in molt, what you'll see, and these are broken feathers, you'll see broken feathers in these birds that you're going to judge, but don't look at them and judge them as molting birds because they're just broken. So if the bird is in active molt, you'll notice that there's a white, clean, shiny new feather amongst the tattered old ones. And this is actually very apparent in the cage layers because cage layers beat up their wings pretty good when they're in a cage. And so you'll see that molt easier. I'm actually going to pull this white one out. She might not be totally through her molt, and I'm just going to check to see if I can show you anything cool on her. Nope. She does not appear to have lost any feathers to make a cool comparison. So that's molt in a nutshell. So I'm going to pop her back inside. And that's pretty much it. So that's how we handle our birds, to look at the different aspects of how well they've bleached out and what their current lay capacity is. So with that, before we move into classes, are there any questions overall about the process or anything that you saw related to placing these showbirds? Is there a reason I picked the 2 specific birds? No, I just kind of pulled birds. I wouldn't say I picked these 2 specifically. I actually have 3 others in a cage down here in case these guys didn't cooperate. I did try to pick a couple that had different abdominal capacities so that you could see that. Yeah, but otherwise I just picked white birds that were calm.
Any other questions before we move on? I am not seeing any hands raised. So one of the questions, and I think Mary Ann actually answered it earlier, was after a production hen loses their pigment, can they still lay eggs with pigment?
Oh yeah, for sure. Because they're getting, once they lose their pigmentation, that's just in their skin. And that's just a reflection that the hen isn't putting any of the carotenoids, the color from her food, into her skin anymore. It's all going into the eggs.
I think that's it, Amy, for the questions in the chat right now.
All right, so what I'm gonna do here is jump up and share my screen. Let's see, share my general screen. We're gonna just transition into the judging classes. Okay. So I see somebody's got their hand raised. Chloe, what's going on?
I kind of have an off-topic question. What do you do if your chickens are eating eggs? Eating their own eggs? Because we have like 2 chickens that are becoming broody. So, and we tried to fill eggs with mustard, and it kind of sort of didn't work out. Do you have any other tips?
Chloe, can we save that question to the end?
Yeah,
All
it's a
right,
good, it's a
save
good
that to
question,
the end.
but we'll save it. Yeah, no, keep that in mind because there's actually some solutions. Not a lot, but there's some. All right, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna jump into livestockjudging.com, and you're gonna be sent a link on how to access this if you want to review the classes on your own. But we're gonna go over a couple of the classes today and look at what you would see in a judging setting. So I think this one's good. So when you click on a link, what'll happen is they'll make me log in. Oops. So let me pull up the login info super quick. Well, let me stop screen sharing before I do that.
Amy, if you don't mind, before you jump into those classes, we did have one more question on handling.
Yeah, what's up?
So if you have a bird that is more aggressive, or I guess in our case more flighty, because they do come from commercial production, how do you, any suggestions for handling them, or if you do have ones that are pecking, how do you suggest handling them in that situation?
Yeah, so if they're really flighty and really scared, just give them a little bit of time to calm down. Usually after a couple folks will handle them, they'll be like, oh, this is what this is, and they'll be a little less scared. If they're really flighty, what I suggest is reaching into the cage. Don't avoid handling them unless you think you can see the pigmentation really well. You can look at them from the cage, so you don't have to take them out. You could just look at the pigment in the cage if you're not comfortable handling a bird and say, okay, this bird looks approximately like it's lost this much pigment. Of course, you won't be able to see things like behind the earlobe, you won't be able to see the vent, and you won't be able to see the toe pads, but you'll be able to see the shanks and the tops of the toes, which are honestly probably going to be the most dominant differences in a class that you see. So that's one thing you can do. If you want to handle the bird, you can go ahead, reach in, and then just hug the bird to you, not too tight. They breathe like balloons, right? So we need to make sure that they can breathe. But hold that bird close to you, securely to you, and it's, give it that sense of security that things are okay. Yeah. Yep. So Jen says, if you're at state contest and decide you aren't comfortable handling a bird, you don't have to. And that's the beauty of this. This is a volunteer thing that you're doing. Nobody's gonna, nothing bad's gonna happen if you don't place a class 100% correctly, right? It's an experience, and we don't want you to be uncomfortable during that experience. So you pick whatever's most comfortable to you. Don't cave to peer pressure. If everybody else is handling the bird and you're like, yeah, I'm not going to handle that bird, you don't have to. It's okay. All right. Okay, so I'm gonna find my password. I can't multitask very well. Otherwise, I would have searched as I answered that question, but okay, here we go. So it does log you out after a little bit. So you have to keep logging back in. All right. So the way that this website works is, got to move my screen share icon here because I can't see. So you will go into the site, you will go into Poultry here on the left-hand side of the screen, go on placing, and then go down to laying hens. So click on that, and then what you'll get is this series of 19 videos, which is a pretty good set to practice on. And each one's different, even if they have the same name, they're all different. I've gone through them. And here's what you'll see. So you go ahead and click on your little play icon. And what it's going to do is it's going to play through the videos. So there are 4 birds in a class. So it's going to play through 1, 2, 3, 4 in that order. And if you want, you can toggle, you can scroll down on your screen, and you can go ahead and click the video that you want to see instead. Each bird is labeled with a number in the bottom left corner of the video. So you know, this is bird 1. If I click on the next video, this is bird 2, bird 3, and so on. What makes this super cool is not only can you do individual evaluations on the birds, but you can also scroll down and you can click the 4-screen view of this. So you can see all 4 birds being held up at once, and you can pause the video like I just did, and you can stare at those chicken feet until you get an idea of where those birds place. So it's pretty cool. What I found to be most helpful, and this is coming from somebody who's done this before, and I still find this helpful with this particular judging set, is what I do is I pull up the individual videos first. So I allow it to play through 1, and then as it's playing through, I say, okay, I'm going to take notes on this. What I'm assuming, because they're only showing me the tops of the toes and the shank, is that these birds are otherwise identical. And right now I'm making that class decision based on the tops of the toes and the shanks. So as I'm looking at this, I say bird number 1 looks like it has some pigment in the shank. It looks a little yellow. There's a little yellow on the tips of the toes by the nail. And there's, you know, a little bit of dark scales near the knuckle, right? Where the toes attach. We call it a wrist. It's called a knuckle in birds. All right, so that's bird 1. So I've taken my notes, and this is how you do it when you take them out of the cage. Take the bird out of the cage, look at it, make a couple notes. You'll have a sheet of paper, scorecard on the back, make some notes, and then go to the next bird. And eventually what you'll do is you'll teach yourself how to identify these differences, because you have to stare at them a while. Okay, so that was bird 1. Now it should automatically play into bird 2. There we go. Yep. So I pause it again and I say, wow, this bird has a lot more color on the tops of its toes and its knuckle than the bird that we just saw. And it also looks like it has some more pigmentation in the shanks. All right, so I make my note about that. Play through the video. Sometimes they show these birds in different lights. Okay. That's bird 2. We'll wait for the 14 seconds to play out. Bird 3. And I say to myself, wow, this bird looks like she doesn't have as much pigmentation as the last bird, but she's pretty close to that first bird. So 1 and 3 are similar to me. I'm going to come back to the 1 and 3 pair, because you can go through, judge your birds, and judge your birds, like take notes on each, put them back in the cage, say, okay, I definitely know this bird places here and this bird places here, and then fill in the rest. Look at the 2 birds that they're called a close pair. Look at your close pair again and say, okay, what makes this pair different? And it may end up that you have to look at things like abdominal capacity, fat, and molt. It may just be that maybe you looked at them in slightly different lights, and under the same light, there are differences that you can pick out. So this is number 4, and I say to myself, oh, she's pretty well bleached. She's got some yellowing on her knuckle, a little bit by the tips of her toes. For the most part, she's pretty well bleached. And so once I have those notes for this judging section, I'll go down and say, all right, let's look at all 4 birds together. So I pause the video and I'm looking at those birds, and I knew 3 and 1 looked similar to me, but now looking at them all together, I can see that bird number 1 has a lot more pigment than bird number 3. All right. And I look at number 2, which is this upper right video here. I see number 2. I say, wow, she is definitely the most colored. So she's going to score last, dead last. So what I'll do on my sheet, I'm going to pick up a sheet so I can pay attention to what I'm saying. So I tell you the same thing repeatedly, is I'll say, okay, so number 2 is last. And I'll look at these birds again, and I'll say, well, number 1 actually has quite a bit of pigment overall, but bird number 4 has more pigment like in her knuckle region and along the tops of her toes. So because the hawk comes before the tops of the toes, I think that because the hawk of number 1 is a little darker, and then the hawk of number 1 is a little lighter than number 2, I'm going to put number 1 in 3rd place. Now that I've got those places in my head, I'll say, okay, now I've got to make a decision between 3 and 4. Which of those 2 birds is most bleached? And looking at those birds from this, I'm going to play it again just to see if they shift the light a little bit for me. It appears from my field of vision that number 4 is the most bleached. She looks the most bleached from this video to me. So I'll say, okay, number 4 is first, and then number 3 comes second. So when I have to give my reasons to the judge, I'm going to say, I placed bird number 4 first because she appeared to have the most pigment loss. She was very close to bird number 3, but showed more pigment loss in her shank than number 3. So that's why I placed her. Then I will say the bottom 2 were also a close pair, but I've made the decision that bird number 1 is more bleached than bird number 2 because the tops of the toes have more color in them. And then you can add in, I also evaluated the vent, the eye ring, the earlobe, the beak, and I didn't see any differences. This is where I made my decision. If you end up going to things like the abdominal fat or the abdominal capacity, you can give those reasons too. But basically all the judges want is your thought process. Like, why did you do this? All right, so then what you do at the end is you go to 4, 3, 1, 2. Haha, look, I did it the same twice. That's good. So you can view the officials and they'll give you the reasoning. So I matched the official placing, so I can feel confident in what I did. Now, if I go back to the class and just say, I want to place this differently, I'll reset the placing. And I'm going to do something like totally wrong. So I'm going to flip the 1st and 4th bird. Okay, so on the right-hand side, what you'll see, if you've never placed this class before, and the class hasn't been placed, you have to reset the placing if it's already been placed. But you'll scroll down, you'll see my placing. And what they'll do is they'll give you every combination of order that you can have with these 4 birds. And so you need to really know your order. It's not like a multiple choice test where you can just kind of like poke and hope and say, I'm going to go with C. You can't do that here. You actually have to have some logic behind how you score things. Your scorecard is going to look like this list on the right-hand side of the screen. So I say, okay, this is going to be my mess up judging, right? So I say 4 and 2. 4 and 2 are in the proper order here, but I'm going to flip-flop them. So I'm going to say my order is 2, 2, 3, 1, 4. So I'm going to scroll down, 2, 3, 1, 4. And we'll be like, yeah, let's go place that. So you'll scroll to the bottom, hit submit placing. And well, that stinks. So sometimes what they'll do is they will give you a reason, like oral reasons here as to why you're wrong. I wouldn't take those with a grain of salt. We're gonna go through some more examples next class, but just so that you know, they're not always correct. So we'll go through some examples, but if you have any questions, let any of us know and we can help you through them. But what's really cool is they give you the frequency of other folks like you who've placed these classes. And you can see how the different placings are here on the left-hand side, and the frequency comes up here in the middle. The frequency is the number of people who have placed the class the way that you did, and your way is highlighted in green. So when I scroll down here, I see the frequency of that guess, that really bad guess that I know was wrong, is 8. And I'm like, okay, well, this class has been judged a whole lot of times, because look, I see 150 and 232 down here. So what you'll do is you'll scroll down and see, okay, which number has the highest frequency? That's going to be your correct answer, just if you're double checking yourself. And then if you have it right, you can say, yay, I did it, and then go to the next class. If you have it wrong, you need to go back and say, okay, what did I do wrong? Why is this bird placed like this? It could be that you just missed something. So go through your list. I have to write my list down because I can't remember it all the time. So then I ring earlobe, beak, bottom of foot, hawk, tops of toes. I've got that here. So I'm looking at the tops of the toes and the shank in those videos. So I say, okay, what did I miss? And that's how I check myself. So we're going to go to another class. So you'll go back to the top of the screen. You'll go to laying hens. And then let's pick Paris 2. That sounds fancy. All right, so we're going to do the exact same thing. Oh, this is fun. This is a pullet class. So they are grading a pullet class as past production hens. These birds have just come into lay. There's very little difference in between the coloring. You're not going to see this. You shouldn't see this, but just going through this class, go through this class just to see. When I pull, I'm not going to go through this with you just because it is so kind of like out there. But if you look at these birds all together, it's really difficult to tell the pigment loss because there's not a lot of pigment loss. You may have to judge these birds based on abdominal capacity if you actually see them in contest. Looking at this from the screen, the way that the yellow is captured and shown with my resolution, I'm having a really hard time seeing differences in these birds. So in person, I think you'll be able to see that a little better. And like I said, you can break ties with abdominal capacity and fat and molt. So let's go back to laying hens. Let's choose Deer Park. That sounds good. So these are real old hens. You could tell because their nails are real long and curly. So these girls are going to have a lot of bleaching. All right. So one of the things you'll notice that there's bright yellow scales at the tops of the toes. These are the tops of the knuckle. These scales haven't molted out yet, right? Because we see the shank on that bird, the shank right here, that shank is white. That is pearly white. We also see the tops of the toes are pretty white on this bird. Oops. Right, so she's pretty bleached out. I would say that these scales, if it had to come down to a tiebreaker, you could say, you know, these scales mean something, but generally we're still going to ignore them. Okay, so we say she's pearly white except for her knuckle, which has some yellow scales on it. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next video. This is bird number 2. So see how they changed the lighting a little bit? But what I want to bring your attention to is, look at this. She's got some yellow pigment on the tips of those toes. So that's really different than the other bird. So when I'm looking at this class, I'm going to say bird 1, I think she's pretty bleached. So I'm going to put her at the top of my paper. Bird number 2 has pigment. So I'm going to put her somewhere down lower on the page. And I'm going to say pigment, toe tips. Okay, so I can come back to that and see if any other birds have that. Okay, so, okay, she's got some pigment in her toe tips. She also has some pigment in her shank. There's not a lot, but there's some. She's not as pearly white as the other one, for sure. Okay, next bird we go to. See, they're changing the light on you. This is why you do the same light every time. All right, anyway, so she's pretty well pearly white. She's got some colored scales on her knuckles, but these are much lighter. It looks like these have already shedded out, where bird number 1 did not shed out. If we're looking at the bleaching of this bird versus bird number 1, I would say, well, she's got, you know, some pigment on the tops of her toes. So I would say this is where it gets tricky, right? Because the other one has really yellow scales, but no pigment down her shanks. So I personally would say that this bird, number 3, has more pigment than bird number 1, because I'm going to ignore those bright yellow scales at the bottom of bird number 1. So I'm going to say number 3 is going to place above number 1, and number 2 is still down there. We saw some yellow on the tips of her toes. Oops. Oh, well, they also, for these birds, they're also showing how they look in the cage. So this is an example of how you can look at abdominal capacity without actually having to touch the birds. So what they're doing, and this is how the birds might look, by the way. And so when you're giving your oral reasons, there's nothing really to say in regards to their health. They're healthy. They just are a little beat up because they've been in a cage setting. So this is perfectly normal for a past production hen to look. Don't worry, she's okay. But you can very easily see the vent on them, which is what I was sharing before. And you can easily see the fat pad without even having to pick that bird up. So we're looking at her back right now, looking for any brand new feathers and signs of molt. We're looking at how wide she is on the back. And then they shoot back to the feet of that bird. The next bird, the last bird. So she's got some really bright yellow scales on her knuckle, and her toe tips are real bright. The rest of her is pretty much bleached. So because she's so incredibly bright on her toe tips, and she's got these scales, she's my tiebreaker between 2 and 4, right? So this one has more pigment, so she's going to go below number 2. So what I'll do then is just play through the whole video. All right, we see your toes, pretty, they're gorgeous. We see her in the cage. One of the things that you see on her is, see how she's got these pearly white feathers? She's molting. She's molting. So if you spread the wing apart, what you'll probably see is the new primary feathers growing back in, and you can tell they're new because they're not yellow and they're not missing parts of their barbs. They're full feathers. And so this bird, looks like she's in molt. So that confirms to me, yeah, this bird's definitely below the other bird. All right. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and play all 4 together and see if what we came up with matches what we thought. Ooh, that's interesting. We're going to full screen it. All right. Still feeling pretty confident about my placing. Number 3 is most bleached. Number 1 is second bleached. Number 2 is third. Number 4 is 4th. Okay, looking good. Birds in the cage. This bird, you can see she's got molted feathers. This bird is in super high production in part because she looks so terrible. And that's one of the things to keep in mind. The more terrible a bird looks, if they're shiny and pretty and perfect, they're in molt, right? If they're the same age, which they are in your class. If a bird looks ratty and scrappy looking, they're probably, they're not in molt, so they're in lay. So you can see the backs of all these birds, the body depth capacity. Looking at them walking around. All right, so feeling pretty confident in that placing. And then we can go ahead and place it if we want. So I said 3, 1, 2, 4. Submit the placing. 3, 1, 2, 4. So this is one of the ones where they're talking about scales. I would not follow the scale thing. I know that's why they placed it this way, is because of the scales. When we look down at, because this is what the official placing is based on whoever put up this video, but if we scroll down and we look at the frequency, we can see that our score is the highest ranked out of everybody. So this is what the answer is. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. That'll get you started in this. If you want to play through the classes, I think Brian's gonna send you a link. He can correct me if you know, what that looks like. And then next week, we're gonna just take 30 minutes or so, go through the classes, then answer questions as we go through. So,
Yep, and I will send out that link tomorrow, the directions on how to do it. So they have to sign up, and then I will assign, once they're signed up, we can assign classes to them.
perfect.
So it's up to them if they want to sign up for class, sign up for it or not, but I will send that directions out to everybody tomorrow.
Okay, perfect. So at this point, we'll answer any questions related to this class to get those questions on the recording. And then once we stop the recording, then we'll open it up for a couple minutes, not too long, just a couple minutes to see if there are any additional questions that are maybe outside the scope of this class. So class-related questions first, if there are any.
Any questions, guys? So I'm gonna, if there's none, I'm gonna stop recording and we'll take just 2 minutes to answer any of the questions.
Okay, so 2 minutes, it sounds like about 3 questions, if they're not long.
One question in the chat, does the